Good afternoon. My name is Leonora Aileen. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for California Studies. And most people know us for the wonderful fellows programs which we run, some of whom are here. The Assembly Fellows are here. It's a great program. If you're interested in public policy and how it's made and implemented, it's a great program. You get to spend 11 months working at high levels of state government. Please see me after if you're interested, or I'll put the link to the application in the chat for people online. But we also support research of wonderful folks like Dr. Towler on issues, applied policy research and issues of interest to the public. Short bio on Dr. Towler. He's an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at Sac State. His research and teaching interests include American politics, race and ethnicity, and methodology. More specifically, his work examines ideological predispositions, alienation, political allegiance, and support. Recent projects examine the dynamic relationship between progressive social movements and far-right movements reacting to great social change. He received his PhD and MA from the University of Washington, Seattle, and holds a BA from the University of Colorado. While recent research has been published in Perspectives on Politics, Journal of Race, Ethnicity and Politics, and Du Bois Review, Dr. Towler also directs the BlackVoter Project Public Opinion Survey, which we're going to hear about today, a national survey project of Black Americans with results highlighted in Politico Magazine, The Washington Post, Time Magazine, USA Today, Seattle Times, and The Atlantic. Please welcome Dr. Towler.
Thank you so much for joining me here this afternoon. Eat away. Lunchtime events are awesome, so please do enjoy your food. I'm going to talk for about 35 minutes here, and then we'll have time to ask questions and hold a discussion. I'm going to talk about some of the survey work that I do and relate it to some of what I consider to be the most interesting research questions around African American politics in contemporary America. Afterwards, I'd be happy to take any questions on the poll, the BlackVoter Project itself, public opinion, politics, the election that's coming up, or really anything that we want to talk about for the time that we have left. As mentioned, I am in the Department of Political Science here on campus. I have been running a survey since 2016 that has now become a series of, I think it's going on 7 surveys of strictly African American public opinion. To me, in graduate school, this became an area that I really wanted to dedicate part of my career to, because in order to study Black politics as a graduate student, I had to basically determine my research interests on the data that was available. And there wasn't much of it. And so I wasn't able to just say, oh, I want to study this. Let's go look at it, because I would then have to create an entire project to collect the data that I potentially was interested in or needed to answer a question I had. Unlike research questions that were not specific to not just the Black community, but many racial ethnic minority communities, there's data that's been collected for 50, 60, 70 years now, year in and year out, and you don't really have to search in ways to find answers to those questions. You don't have to start from scratch. And so in 2016, when I had my first job at Western Washington University, I applied for funding and ran a pilot study, which we're going to talk about in a second, that has turned into 3 national surveys, a statewide poll, and now I'm currently fielding another national survey and going to field a post-election California poll through support through the Center for California Studies. And so for me, this has been an ongoing project that I've now partnered with the Center for, that's going to hopefully continue to allow this data to be collected. Some news was some of my surveys actually were picked up by Roper, and so they're now going to be archived and public access data as well, which is ultimately what the point of this is to create another space for accessible data on the Black community. I guess I'll use the clicker. To get started, though, I want to dive into the questions that I'm most interested in regarding African American politics, and that will allow us to then look at some of the data that's been collected and understand how it's unique. It requires unique data to answer what might seem like some simple political questions. For me, coming of age in graduate school, entered graduate school summer of 2008. You can only imagine what type of political socialization takes place studying politics under Barack Obama's tenure. And so very quickly, you get pulled into that movement, that sort of historical moment, and I got really interested in this idea of social movements, first trying to understand President Obama's rise to the presidency as a sort of quasi-social movement, but also trying to understand what it meant and the reaction to President Obama's presidency in the long course of history. And so for me, I looked at President Obama and the movements that followed as sort of a dynamic process, trying to understand questions around social movements for change, often being followed by counter movements pushing back towards the status quo. And as I mentioned, right, for me, the most recent change, this most recent momentous change was the election of President Obama. But very quickly after that, we saw a contemporary counter movement, starting with the Tea Party, materializing into the election of Donald Trump in 2016, and now we have this MAGA movement that sort of encapsulates that space, right? And so there's this dynamic taking place between these political movements, somewhat social, somewhat political, that really got me interested in understanding what's things going to look like, especially for black politics, following President Obama's tenure, right? Term limits on presidents, he was gonna have to leave office, right? And so things were going to either go back to normal or fundamentally change moving forward. And so I wanted to understand African American political movements post-Obama, and I had two sort of ways of theorizing about this. The first was within this movement dynamic framework, and I was curious as if there would be a black counter movement in response to the Trump MAGA movement that was reacting to Obama. And so I wanted to take a look at how these movements might continue reacting to one another, or if it would just end, right? And so throughout history, we have moments where we have major movements towards change. We can talk about Civil War and Reconstruction. We can talk about the Civil Rights Movement. We can talk about the Know Nothings movement in the 1950s, responding to Jacksonian democracy. But there are these historical moments that push our country towards a more sort of democratic future that are very quickly and very fiercely met with counter movements trying to halt that change. And that's what we saw going on in 2008, starting really in 2009 with the Tea Party all the way up till 2016. And so I was curious then if this counter movement sort of framework would continue. And so my one thought was, if so, maybe we could see that as a defining feature of African American politics post-Obama. Maybe we could see Trump actually scaring or pushing black people to vote, to continue to remain politically active, even though you don't have this first African American black president mobilizing enthusiastic people. Okay, so that's one sort of theoretical question I was asking. The second had to do with, okay, what about this sense of empowerment? Much research has shown that, yes, black turnout was the highest it's been in centuries, right? Pretty much since the Reconstruction period during Obama's tenure, because people wanted to vote for the first black president. There is some historical significance there that was empowering, that was inspiring, that made people, especially black people, feel like they could influence politics in a new and different way. What happens to that sense of empowerment once Obama leaves office, right? We clearly did not get another black person on the presidential ticket, right, in 2016. Have yet to see that, not sure when in history that will happen. So what do we make of this moment of empowerment? And so I started to look for other spaces where we might find attachment to figures, political or otherwise, that could drive this type of empowerment. And one place I ended up in 2016 was with sports athletes, specifically at the time Colin Kaepernick, who had become a very prominent national political figure because of his protests during the national anthem in the NFL. And so that has led me down a separate but related line of research where on the one hand I'm saying, okay, we have this movement, counter-movement dynamic where threat might drive African Americans into politics and continue to mobilize post-Obama, but we also might have some other less sort of traditional political figures. In this case, I'm focusing on sports athletes that might empower black people in ways that we saw during Obama, right? Without necessarily a politician at the top of the ticket. And so these are the two frameworks that I've been working from and using my survey project to collect data to answer these, what really, if you think about general American politics, are somewhat simplistic questions, right? If one group challenges another group, will that group participate? That's a pretty simple political science question, right? The other question, if one group has political leaders that they see inspiring, will they participate? Will this cause them to mobilize? That's, again, a pretty simple question. But without data specifically designed to collect the opinions of black Americans, we can't answer these questions for the black community, okay? And so that's where I'm starting with this presentation, right? And so when we look at social movement mobilization throughout history and in the literature and in research, we see that there are traditional mobilizing factors. There's basically a resource mobilization model that says things such as education, things such as income, interest in politics, age, resources, essentially determine whether or not one participates in politics. I'm saying that's often the case, but within the black community, we need to look at some other elements, right? And I'm saying there's two alternative frameworks, the ones I just mentioned, one dealing with political empowerment and one dealing with political context that could be mobilizing in ways that might overcome some of these traditional barriers to resources that black Americans face. And so I really want to know, what can we do to create a black movement or a new black counter-movement, political counter-movement post-Obama? The political map changed during Obama's years. We really saw a new electoral college in place where states like North Carolina, Virginia, right? Georgia is a product of that today, don't fool yourself. Even states like Ohio, Indiana, were either purple or blue because of the way that not just the country turned out, but specifically black voters turned out, right? And so if we start with empowerment, we can see that literature around this suggests inclusion in the democratic decision-making process make one feel like they can actually affect politics and makes it more likely that they will get out there and vote. And so this sense of political representation is really essential for understanding whether or not one participates, and it's extremely essential for the black community because we don't traditionally have a large number of black representatives. And so understanding what type of representation may facilitate participation post-Obama is going to be essential to understanding how the country pushes forward and how black voters can continue or maybe won't continue to affect politics in similar ways. Empowerment, as I mentioned, is mobilizing. New research actually suggests that pride, this sense of inspiration or pride, is the most powerful mobilizing factor, and that there's actually an anger gap, and that within the black community, you want to try to empower people, because if you try to encourage people to participate by using negative ads or making them angry, black people are less likely to actually do so because of the social restrictions around black anger. And that there's so much stereotype and stigma around black people, black men, black women, acting angry, acting out of anger, that the black community in itself has really become far more reserved than much of society. And it's uncouth for black people to get angry and thus to act out of anger. And so really the way that we want to move forward is to find ways to empower the black community, to mobilize through pride, through inspiration, through hope. It's just still unclear how we're actually going to do that without Obama, right? And so I'm going to offer some ideas here. And so there's this enthusiasm advantage that comes along with empowerment, but you need to have a candidate able to generate the excitement. And so if we look at turnout, this is the gap in turnout from, what does it start at, 96 all the way up till 2020. The zero marker there being the moments in history where African American turnout and white turnout were even, where there was zero difference between the turnout. And what we can see is that through much of history, there's a gap, a significant gap, where white turnout supersedes black turnout by a good amount until you get here to 2008. 2008, that gap dramatically closes, and in 2012, that gap reverses. And for the first time in American history, during Obama's run for his second term, we see African American turnout rates actually rise above those of whites. Speaking to the importance of this empowerment, how important it is to have representation, to have someone running for or in political office that a community can relate to. So what do we do when there's a lack of enthusiasm? What do we do when we don't have this representation, right? Does anyone know when the next Obama is going to come? Abrams Prize is going to win Georgia, so it's going to be tough, right? And so that's really where I'm headed with this. And so for the next part of the presentation, I'm going to kind of do a quick assessment of the current political environment when it comes to turnout, African American participation, representation, and discuss the likely sources of either threat, one way that I argue you can mobilize, or empowerment, okay? Another way, some say the best way to mobilize black community. And then from there, we're going to talk about counter-movement mobilization. We're going to talk about how my data presents opportunities to really draw some conclusions about the way the African American community is reacting to Trump and MAGA and this movement that's in response to Obama initially. And then finally, I'm going to come back to this idea of political empowerment in a roundabout way and discuss maybe some non-traditional actors that could fill this void, maybe temporarily, until we do have another Obama moment. And honestly, literature suggests the first to do something is special no matter what. So even if we do get another African-American black man who runs for president, who wins the Democratic nominee or the Republican nominee, they're likely not going to have the same effect on the black community. There's not going to be the same enthusiasm because it's not going to be that same historical moment. And so we still are going to have to continue to reassess this idea of political empowerment. So remember, downturn in 2016 turnout rates. We saw these highs during the Obama terms. In 2016, if you go back to that chart, the gap explodes once again, right? White turnout rates is far greater, significantly higher than black turnout rates. What does this look like? Well, as we can see here, here's turnout rates for the first time. Black turnout rates rise above those of whites, drop right back down, though, by 2020, right? 2016, 2020, they're at about 60%. And so the gap is back after Obama, right? It's not like Obama encouraged everyone to vote, empowered everyone, and now everyone thinks they can change politics. It's like, no, we want to vote for Obama. Now we're pretty much feeling like we can't do it again. We can't change anything anymore, all right? And so it's kind of the end of an era that we're looking at. And I want to look at some things that could present continued threat after Obama, right? And so we look at some of the things that's been going on with voting rights, creating alienation, apathy, and vote suppression, especially following this Supreme Court decision in 2013 that pretty much negated the Attorney General's role in voting rights altogether, right? And so now we have long, drawn-out court battles, making it even harder to fight for voting rights on a state, local, and federal level. And so we have these groups then, many of whom have been advocating for vote suppression, advocating against the progress, much of which is racial progress, under Obama, starting with the Tea Party. These groups, since Obama, have set the agenda for the Republican Party. They had great success in the midterms following the election of President Obama, ultimately leading to the election of Donald Trump in 2016. Now we have the MAGA movement. We have groups like the Proud Boys following a similar path, right? We're approaching a midterm election where we are likely to see a number of MAGA politicians win office, some Proud Boys, some of the more extreme people with more extreme political affiliations may win office as well. These could represent threats to the black community, to the progress made under Obama, even if it's symbolic racial progress, in ways that could be mobilizing. Along with these continued vote suppression campaigns, there's enough reason to believe that there is a threatening environment there to capitalize on, right? And as I mentioned, we've seen this time and time again in American history. By 1964, following sort of the push of the civil rights movement in the 1950s and early 60s, we see this candidate named Barry Goldwater win the Republican nomination. Goldwater wins the nomination on the back of far-right, local far-right movements, many of whom are campaigning against civil rights on the basis of limited government, but really are steeped in very similar conspiracies that we hear today. Things accusing communism, socialism, race wars, all of those things were part of the politics of the time. And so what we're seeing today, right, is not something new. To suggest that if we can draw any conclusions from what's going on today, it could be useful in the future as well. We're likely to see more of these moments take place. What do we see? Well, I believe that these are enduring attitudes. The far right's not going away anytime soon. As we mentioned, these candidates are there, and Trump still remains one of the favorites sort of to lead 2024 on the Republican nomination. So he's still in play himself, even though, you know, he's kind of having some political issues. We don't really know how this is going to play out. And so if these movements can mobilize, we can use this as a strategy to continue to create a black political voice in a way that can change politics. First, I, starting in 2017, started to look at just what black people think about Trump. Are they telling us things that suggest Trump is a threat? And so here's where I can turn to this data that I've collected, starting with the pilot project in 2017, and then additional data sets following, years in 2019, one data collected in 2020, another in 2021, where I simply ask African Americans across the country, do you approve or disapprove of Trump, and why? And when asking them why, I see first that the vast majority held negative opinions, disapproved of Trump. Close to 70% rated him very unfavorable, like the most extreme disapproval you can. And of those 70% that had negative feelings, there was a sense of threat, a sense of racial threat that stood out, right? And so respondents would say things like, I strongly feel Trump is a racist and is bad for America. Trump seems intent on dividing us as a country, trying to make everyone afraid. He's racist, misogynistic, asinine, infuriating bigot. This is what black people are saying when asked about Trump, right? And so just by looking at their opinions and in their statements on open-ended questions on the survey, there's already a suggestion there. There's already anecdotal evidence that he could be threatening, that this could be a threat that could mobilize people. And so I asked African Americans, or I posited that African Americans who perceive Trump as a threat were going to be more likely to participate or feel confident about their participation. And so in 2017, I turned to one of my first studies in the BlackVoter Project, a survey of 511 black people in a number of battleground states across the country as well as California. When looking at attitudes towards Trump in relationship to turnout, we see a direct relationship just in the bivariate crosstabs. Here we can see that of those that have a strong disagreement of Trump, and this was a question that said, do you think Trump is destroying the country? Right? Those that strongly agree, 82% said that they had participated in 2016. compared to only 59% of those who did not have a strong opinion of Trump or did not agree or have any opinion on whether or not Trump destroyed the country. When asked, do you intend to vote in 2018? This is in a midterm election, just like we're coming into now. We see similar discrepancies, right? Here, 68% of those who strongly believe Trump was destroying the country said, yeah, I'm very confident I'm going to vote in this midterm election, right? Those who didn't express an opinion, we see only 41% say they're going to vote, and we actually see a larger percentage of those who don't, or say they're not going to vote here, who don't express an opinion. And so there's not just people talking about Trump in a negative way, but we see a relationship between those who talk about Trump in a negative way and their participation and intention to participate. When I run it in a multivariate setting, now running statistical models to account for other explanations, taking into account sociodemographics, ideology, region, political opinions on certain issues, we see the relationships remain, such that those who say they strongly agree that Trump is destroying the country are significantly different than those who did not have an opinion on the question when it came to voter turnout in 2016. And so what you can see here is that the errors between these two do not collide, which suggests there's statistically significant differences. And you can say with very good confidence that there's a relationship between negative attitudes towards Trump participation. And we see the same thing when it comes to the 2018 midterms. And so right away, in the heat of the battle, right after Trump's election, I find in this small data set, mind you, a relationship between threat and participation, suggesting that this counter-movement framework might actually be able to continue. This is something that is fruitful that we should continue to talk about. And so I continue to test this on my future surveys. And this is where things get really cool and really interesting, because being able to facilitate original surveys, as I'm able to do right now in combination with the center, allows for you to really take hold of some interesting ideas and methodological approaches that otherwise wouldn't be available. And so in 2019, a survey fielded in November and December, so leading up to sort of the 2020 election year, I was able to this time survey over 1,500 African Americans across the nation. And for this survey, I conducted a priming experiment. And so I asked people in the survey 3 different primes compared to a control. So you would get one prime or the other or nothing at all. And then after presenting the respondents with a prime, I asked them a battery of questions about the importance of political participation. How important is it that you vote in 2020? How important is it that you register to vote? And what I found is that there again is a relationship between threat and participation. In this case, though, I changed the type of threat, trying to understand, is it really racial for Black Americans? How important is race in understanding this threat that I found in the other data? And so the first prime was a racial threat prime, which discussed Donald Trump as a threat to racial progress, and then went on to offer some examples, finalizing by comparing him to Democrats as sort of the juxtaposition. Another group then got an economic or an existential threat prime, where I suggested Donald Trump is a threat to American democracy, a sort of deracialized threat, but still a threat to America. And then a final prime asked about an economic threat, discussing Donald Trump as a threat to working class Americans. And again, offering some evidence and then summing it up by juxtaposing him to Democrats. And so these 3 primes were then compared to a 4th portion of the group that did not get any statement at all. And what I found is that when looking at the answers to participation questions following whether or not you got one of these statements, the only statement that caused individuals to say participation is more important is this racial threat condition. And I controlling then again for a number of other variables in a multivariate setting, I can say with some very good statistical confidence that if you give people this idea, if you prime them to think about threat, Black people to think about threat in a racial way, they're going to be more likely to say it's important to participate in politics. And so this, in combination with the previous findings from the 2017 study, really start to paint a really good picture here of how this could be a useful strategy to mobilize the black community post-Obama, right? And I'm going to emphasize, again, dependent on the collection of original data focused on black opinions, right? 2020, I decided I'm going to go a step further and I'm going to run another experiment. I've kind of found my way when it comes to threat. I have a good understanding of the relationship between threat and participation and a better understanding of the importance of race in this threat. And so on a 2020 survey, this one fielded in June and July of 2020, prior to the 2020 election, of over 1,300 respondents across the nation, I conducted another primate experiment, but this time I compared a threat condition, a racial threat condition, very similar to the condition in the previous experiment, to a hope condition, trying to understand if there's any leverage in empowering black Americans through Biden and through the current Democratic Party. And so the red here is different portions of the threat, and then both ended with the same, again, sort of statement about Democrats. What I find, not surprisingly, the hope condition has zero statistical power, does not change people's views on the importance of participation, where this threat condition, again, this racial threat condition, matters, right? It may increase the probability that someone would say it's important to vote by 7%, just by having them read this statement before answering questions. And so you can only imagine what a campaign might look like within the black community focusing on this type of threat. That's hammering people with information week in and week out, right? Ad campaigns, flyers, door to door. And so this is where this gets really interesting and exciting, because I'm actually finding ways here to strategically engage the black community without having an Obama on the ticket, right? And so the implications here, right, are that framing Trump, MAGA, and the GOP as a threat to racial progress will increase the likelihood of political participation. Framing Biden, on the other hand, as a positive candidate, invoking hope, did not do jack. We can all, we can discuss afterwards why. That might be fun. But there was no relationship between someone being primed to think about Biden and racial progress in the Democratic Party and wanting to participate more, right? But threat worked. And finally, so looking forward, right, it would be much smarter to focus on threat, these ideas of racism, Trump, and the GOP, MAGA GOP, when appealing to black voters, rather than continuing to try and sell these ideas of hope now that Obama is long gone, right? I'm going to end, though, by saying, what about hope and inspiration? As I said in the beginning, right, this is thought to be, scholarship suggests this is a more effective way to mobilize black people. It's more effective to get people inspired, to get people hopeful, to empower people than to get people angry, especially because black people are not necessarily comfortable expressing anger in social political settings. And so if I'm saying, well, you got to make people angry, what about this hope and inspiration? Are there other ways to think about this? Clearly, Biden's not the answer. And other research, as I'm going to talk about, suggests that Kamala Harris is not the answer either. And so it's not necessarily just finding a black politician, right? There has to be a moment. There has to really be sort of a political, social movement, a historical moment to gain similar empowerment that you saw during the Obama years. But historically, the black community has always looked elsewhere for political leaders. It's not until sort of these last 40, 50 years, contemporary politics, that the black community has actually looked towards traditional politicians to lead them. Prior to the 1960s, it was always grassroots community organizers, faith leaders, celebrities, and athletes that were the political leaders of the black community because of the barriers to voting during the Jim Crow era in this country, and especially during the antebellum period, where there were no voting rights whatsoever. And so maybe we should look towards other places now as well after this Obama era if we really want to gain some new insight on empowerment. As I mentioned, I started by looking at black athletes in 2016 following the killing of Trayvon Martin. A number of athletes started to speak up, Colin Kaepernick being one of them, but it became another one of these political moments where it's like there's something here that's too important to miss. And I can use this opportunity that I have to collect data to really take a look at these in ways that no one else is really going to. And if you're not really focused on this, if you're not being intentional about it, you're not going to have the right questions, have the right measures to see what's going on. And so as I got more into this, it became very clear that this idea of black athletes entering politics and being activists is not new, that this is something that's been around for a while, right? We see it in the 1960s, the famous picture, Tommy Shelby and John Carlos posting with the black power symbol, their fists up at the 1968 Olympics. Also in the 1968 Olympics, we see Wayoma Tyrus wearing black shorts to receive her gold medal in protest, right? And so during this civil rights period, we already have black athletes making political statements, right? Here on global stages at the Olympics. We also have more famous sort of historical figures here, Muhammad Ali, right? Dodged the draft, did not go to Vietnam, lost his heavyweight title, was banned from boxing in response, right, because of his protest and his activism. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, right, another historical figure, now a major political voice in the black community. And more recently, right, in 2016, we saw the NBA. Here, the Miami Heat wore hoodies prior to one of their games following Trayvon Martin's death in response and in sort of reaction to him being profiled for wearing a hoodie. The WNBA quickly jumped in as well. Were some of the first athletes to wear Black Lives Matter t-shirts on the court. And then, as I mentioned, right, Colin Kaepernick sort of takes this mantle up. The response by the country and the NFL pretty much ousting him from the league, put him at the center of this conversation for some time. But we've recently seen other celebrity athletes, black celebrity athletes, Naomi Osaka, LeBron James, continue to sort of take up this activism in different ways. And so I said, okay, could this be empowerment? It's not Obama, it's not a politician, but could this be something that we need to be looking at moving forward? Because we don't know when we're going to get another Obama. We just don't know. So we have to start looking outside the box if we truly believe that empowerment is as important to political participation as we think it is. And so here, I thought that African Americans who hold positive attitudes towards these black celebrity athletes will participate in politics at higher rates. They might be empowered. So again, I looked first at the 2017 data, and then I'll talk about some additional research that took place with the 2019 and the 2020 data as well. It's important to point out that even though I feel like I'm doing this research in a very unique way, my research is not the only research that suggests there's something going on, right? And so this is from a USA Today poll, asking people, who is your top choice to lead the Black Lives Matter movement? I think this is in 2016, Colin Kaepernick by a long shot, right? And so it's not unique to my data or my ideas that Colin Kaepernick is seen as a leader at this time. I just wanted to take it a step further and see if there was any connection between him as a political leader or a perceived political leader and actual behavior and attitudes within the black community. And so from the 2017 data, I first looked at the relationship between opinions of Colin Kaepernick, whether or not you approved of his protest, and political behavior. Again, voting in 2016 and confidence of your vote in a midterm. I also here looked at attitudes towards the Black Lives Matter movement. The question was, how strongly do you identify with the Black Lives Matter movement? Because of how Colin Kaepernick was so wrapped up in sort of the Black Lives Matter politics of the time and taking up the mantle of the movement without necessarily officially affiliating himself with the movement. I wanted to be sure I wasn't conflating the two. right? And what I find is that when it comes to voting in 2017, there's not really much relationship here when it comes to attitudes towards Colin Kaepernick. Those who approve and disapprove pretty much say they participated the same and are going to participate the same. The real differences here come out when you look at the Black Lives Matter movement attachment. And that here, those who have a weak attachment or say they are weakly identified with the Black Lives Matter movement are the 10% less to vote in 2016 and 11% less confident that they're going to vote. That's not the end of the story, though. I also wanted to look at things beyond voting. A lot of research says these can oftentimes be even more important, especially things such as donating and getting in your representative's ear to policy change. And what I see is that there are some differences here. And that not only can we not limit ourselves to traditional political figures, but we can't limit ourselves to traditional forms of political participation as well. And what we see is that when asked if you signed a petition, those who strongly approve of Kaepernick, right, I get about almost twice as many who say they've signed a petition. Similar differences here when it comes to have you boycotted, have you participated in a demonstration or protest, attend a political meeting, contact a representative, donate. There's differences, right? And so at the time in 2016 or 2017, Colin Kaepernick was affecting politics. There was a relationship between his protest and behavior. It just didn't show in electoral politics at that moment. Again, I wasn't done. I wanted to see if this was conditional, and what I see is it was. And there is a strong relationship between how people feel about Kaepernick and how people feel about Black Lives Matter, such that those who have a strong Black Lives Matter identity and approve of Colin Kaepernick were even more likely to participate in these acts, even more likely to sign a petition, to boycott, to contact a representative, so that yes, Kaepernick is influencing people, but he's not working alone in solidarity. And these attitudes, understanding empowerment in this way is far more complex than just saying, oh, we believe in Kaepernick. No, it's what Kaepernick has engulfed himself in. This larger movement is important as well. Fast forward a couple years, 2019, on this survey, I decided I'm just going to ask people straight up. Has Colin Kaepernick's protest ever inspired you to do any of the following? Donate, boycott, attend a protest, vote. And what I see is there is a relationship in all of these except for voting. And so again, Colin Kaepernick seems to influence people to participate in non-electoral ways, but when it comes to voting, right, less likely that we're going to see these differences. 2020, I continue to ask these questions, and lo and behold, we actually start to see relationships here between Colin Kaepernick, and on this survey I asked about LeBron James, and electoral participation that we didn't see in the years prior. And so what we end up having is a trajectory of influence such that Colin Kaepernick, in the beginning, is really seen as a protest, a symbol of protest. At one time in 2016, he even says, I don't vote. I don't believe in it. Later on, he recants and says, no, actually, we should vote. I take that back. All right? It's important to vote. But he changes, the meaning behind him as a political leader changes as well over time, such that by the time we get to 2020, we see that there is a stronger relationship between Colin Kaepernick and LeBron James in political participation in the black community than there is for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. And that these non-traditional political leaders, if you have a strong view of these non-traditional political leaders, there's more people that are going to vote or say they're going to vote than if you have a strong view of these traditional political leaders, even Harris, right? Suggesting there's absolutely more here that needs to be investigated. There's reason to believe empowerment is at work, albeit through other movements, right, through either Black Lives Matter or other contexts at the time. But there is some fruit here in understanding what these non-traditional political leaders may offer beyond the traditional ones at the time. I did one last step here in the 2020 data. I looked at this relationship just among those who were considered low propensity voters, or those unlikely to vote, so those who said they did not vote in 2016 or 2018, the past two elections, and Joe Biden drops even more. And so this traditional political presidential candidate is highly uncorrelated with political participation among unlikely black voters. And what we see is that it's actually Kaepernick and LeBron James. Kamala Harris gets a bump, and so there is some empowerment taking place here, but it still remains that if you really want to talk about mobilizing those who are the least likely to participate in the black community, you really have to start moving beyond these mainstream traditional political figures. You have to zone in on someone who the community relates to in a different way. All right, so to sum up, we'll have a few minutes for questions and comments here. What does this mean moving forward? Well, there are some hints that Democrats are catching on to some of this stuff. This is 2020. In 2020, right, Biden did launch some national ads that focused on racism here. This one was in Detroit, right, trying to use this threat of Trump and MAGA to mobilize people. But these examples are few and far between, right? This is not a major ad campaign, and I have no idea if it's specifically targeted towards any part of the black community that makes a difference, right? And as we talked about, there's so many elements here that you could look at by having very robust, the right type of data that's needed to really understand these relationships. And then we also see 2020, this search for empowerment taking place as well. Here, Biden and Harris ran an ad campaign that featured black mayors, so trying to get into the local level politics here using black representation. But as my sort of data and research suggests, that still might not be enough. That you might have to find some partnerships and some collaborations outside of traditional politics to really use this empowerment frame effectively post-Obama. And so moving forward, we have these two areas, right? But there's so much more we can learn and so much more we can do. That's why I'm going to continue to collect data, continue to do research in these ways, because otherwise there's going to be missing pieces, right? And we're going to look back on this era and say, well, what the hell happened after Obama? Why did we reverse? Why did the pendulum swing so far back so quickly, similar to after the Civil Rights Movement? By 1968, we were back to a very, very conservative national politics, such that by the 1970s and into the 80s, when we get into the the Reagan era of politics, there was no turning back. And we were into a whole new generation that had completely moved on from civil rights. Is that where we're headed now, right? I'm hoping not, if we can use some of these types of strategies, but if we're not focusing in, if we're not really interrogating how we make these strategies work, we might very well have the pendulum swing back and enter another generation of conservative politics, unwilling and unwanting to continue to look at progress the same way we did under Obama's administration. That's what I got for us. Like I said, we got some time left. I'm happy to take some questions in the last few minutes here. Thank you. I see. Okay, go ahead.
First, my question is about those competing interests of the threat factor versus hope. And it feels like corporate media always tries to create this dichotomy between, Democrats have to choose between this message of progress and hope and their policies, or talk about Trump and the MAGA agenda. And so I guess my question is, thinking about your own research and talking about how effective threats and fear can be in getting people of color to the polls, how do you balance that, those competing interests of, actually getting people to vote for candidates interested in progress, while at the same time talking about a forward-thinking agenda?
Yeah, I think.
Let me ask my question.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. I just want also for you to actually say about threat and anger. I'm wondering if they intersect. I don't know how to break that down. If the threat of racial instability to blacks also invoke anger and then motivation. I'm just confused.
That's exactly how the relationship works. Political psychology suggests that threat activates anxiety, which then can lead to either anger or fear. And if you can activate anger, that causes people to then act and move forward, where fear causes people to regress and kind of move away. And so the mobilization that comes from threat is absolutely due to anger. And that's why it's been so effective for the Tea Party, for Trump, and for MAGA, because they've been able to evoke such strong feelings of anger in response to sort of this progressive movement, this Obama progressive movement, that gets people out to vote, right? That gets these small but significant populations voting at very high rates because they're very, very angry about how America is looking, right? And so, yes, that's kind of what I'm advocating in a way here for the threat strategy. I think the answer doesn't necessarily lie in picking one strategy versus the other, but it lies in very targeted resources. And if you don't have a way to empower the black community in the short term, you need to focus on some other strategy that can be targeted ads in a very specific area at a very specific time that's different from maybe the campaigns you're running across different parts of the country. And that way it allows you to play into some other constituencies, but you have to have this be part of your message towards the black community, and I would argue the main message towards the black community, in order to get levels of political participation similar to what we saw under Obama. The last thing is, though, and it's very, very difficult to build empowerment that lasts, right? And as you see, even the empowerment that we saw under President Obama has pretty much dissipated, right? By 2016, it was gone. 2020, we see a little bit of an increase in participation, but it's likely just due to people being upset with Trump, this threat, more so than anyone actually feeling more confident in their ability to change the system and their voice being heard. And so it really takes years and years and years, decades, to empower people in a very sustainable, enduring way. And so for the short term, it would behoove Democrats to really consider how this threat can be utilized while it's still out on the table, right? And if we see a few election cycles come through where conservative candidates capitalize on threat and anger and eventually don't need to put in extreme candidates anymore, don't need to get people as angry to get their victories, we might not be in a moment where it's as obvious what the threat is, where it's as easy to find a threat to mobilize people on. And then you go back to, okay, well, how do we empower people? Well, that's even harder, it seems. And so we're at sort of a pivotal moment in American history where we have the opportunity to continue to push black people to vote in ways that we historically don't see, and continue to keep pushing our country forward to continue this progressive movement that we saw start in 2008. Yes?
Well, there's actually a question from the virtual audience.
Absolutely.
So, have you seen John Legend's reel encouraging voting on the statewide BBC site? He said it's great, and do you think musicians affect voting?
I think they can. I have no idea yet. And so on the current survey I'm running right now, I'm actually asking questions like that. I'm now comparing these sports athletes to like Jay-Z and some other possible black celebrities, and trying to expand this framework beyond just the celebrity athlete to possibly more general celebrities. There is evidence that suggests celebrities do matter. I don't know, y'all might be too young for this, but Oprah Winfrey came out and endorsed Barack Obama in the primaries. Research has shown that gave Barack Obama an estimated 2 million more votes, her endorsement alone in the primaries. And so celebrities do matter in politics. There's a long literature here. I just don't know exactly how much they matter specifically for black voters because nobody's really looked at that, right? Historically, it suggests, yeah, if a black celebrity says something, black people are going to react, but does that actually have a real causal relationship with their political behavior? And so that's a great question, and these are things that, again, I'm continuing to ask and just speak to the importance and necessity of survey work like this. Yes?
I was wondering if you think the black women have the same sense of empowerment that Obama had. Not also what kind of roles does the ineffective, like if the Democratic Party not being effective at pursuing or like what their campaign promises are, then how does that play into this as well? Because I feel like they make large promises and they
Yeah. No, that's a great question. I think that the idea of a black woman running for president is going to be very complex and interesting to understand because we've already had a black president. And so there needs to be a black woman that is going to break through barriers in ways that the black community feels like we haven't already done, right? As my data suggests, Kamala Harris would not fit that bill, right? She is in some ways too traditional, too much of a politician for the black community to get behind her in ways that they got behind Barack Obama. And she wouldn't be the first black or non-white president, right? So it would really have to be someone who is cut from a different mold at this point. And that's what the literature suggests, right? That after the first, it becomes much harder to continue to gain the same type of empowerment. As far as the actual party fulfilling these promises, that can really matter in terms of building long-term empowerment. But short-term empowerment, this descriptive representation, does matter, as we saw with Obama, as we've seen with many other cases. We're seeing it kind of take place in LA right now with Karen Bass's mayoral run, right? These short-term runs can matter, but in order to actually have substantive policy consequences, you have to have a lot of these short-term runs, and you have to have these short-term runs materialize into long-term tenures. You have to have some sense of incumbency in order for policy to actually get done. Then we can talk about having a different type of empowerment that's based not just on descriptive representation and what your candidate looks like, but that's based upon a substantive representation as well. And now you're actually going to start talking about policy consequences that keep communities engaged for a long period of time and change the dynamics of city politics, right? And so you can look at places like San Antonio and see sort of how Julian Castro and the Castro brothers there have become not just descriptive, but offered substantive policy consequences to the Latinx population in the city of San Antonio. And they've changed the dynamics there now, right? The city of San Antonio kind of looks different from the rest of Texas because of the way that they've been able to empower different communities. Yeah.
You were talking about this, and like, if you have questions about that, we can talk about that. It was about the kind of conflict in the scholarship you have come across between the initial, I guess, I don't know what words from mouth, like the initial hypothesis, like, well, the hope strategy should be a stronger causal mechanism to reduce voter engagement, and we found the kind of inverse. Can you talk about why you think that conflict exists?
Well, what the literature suggests is that the hope that people felt from Obama is more powerful than any anger or threat that they could feel. And in that sense of empowerment created a larger statistical gain in political participation than feelings of anger. That's kind of what the literature out there says on that right now. My conflict is that we don't have Obama anymore. Okay. And so to say that that's to say that that's a finding is really useful, but to say that that's something we should continue to emphasize and rely upon becomes conflictual, because where do you look for that source, right? Where does that source of empowerment come from? And that's where I'm saying we have to consider other sources, such as threat, to drive people into politics. And then if we really, really are determined to continue to look towards empowerment in a representative way, we have to look towards sources outside of sort of mainstream politics right now, because we don't have that source. We don't have that Obama figure anymore. Yeah. We're about out of time. We're over time. There's some food left. Thank you all for coming.